Okay, so yes, welcome everybody to today's CLCC research seminar. I think we're all quite excited, or very excited,
Hopefully.
to have our very own Dr. Michael Weatherburn, who will be presenting on the responsibility of humanities in the 21st century, a rejoinder to Noam Chomsky, no less. And I think it's particularly, I'm particularly looking forward to hearing Michael speak because he has got a really, I think, quite appropriate CV when it comes to looking at Noam Chomsky from this kind of historical perspective. He is a historian by trade, has training from his BA at Oxford University, then his MSc and PhD at Imperial, looking at the history of science. He was also the Marconi Fellow at Oxford University again, looking at the history of technology. And since 2017, I'm sure many, if not all of you know, he's been the field leader of humanities and social sciences here in the CLCC. He not only does he work here, leading the HSS team, teaching, researching, etc. He has many projects and studies which he looks at the public use and understanding of history. So I think we can now pass over to Michael to hear the rejoinder.
Thank you, Mark. This one has some of you will have heard me talk probably in this room before about various projects I've been working on, and I'll explain how I got here. But for this one, I've really sort of dug deep, and I really hope you enjoy it. Right? I suspect there's a lot in here, and I suspect most of you will enjoy about 2/3. It's which third you may not enjoy that I don't know yet. So I really looked there, but as I'll explain, this is the start of something bigger I'm working on. So this is a great time for questions, challenges, rebuttals, further rejoinders to me, and so on. So thanks very much for joining in this November day. You will be surprised to hear this is not, in fact, me meeting Noam Chomsky in 1967. It's the one good output I've seen from an AI tool. I dropped a picture from me on my holidays and said, put me in discussion with Noam Chomsky in 1967, and it produced this. I thought it was pretty good, actually. But apart from that, all of this is my own work. So here's a table of contents, as it were. I'll go through various contextualizations, unpack the particular essay I've singled out for analysis today, and then go on to how do we think about and apply any of these 1960s ideas to the present day, when I'll argue the world has essentially changed quite a lot, and look forward to your ideas. This one says humanities at a crossroads. I think there's probably no one in here who would disagree with me that would say humanities and arts, particularly also social science, feels it is a new kind of state or a state of flux. People know a very strong sense of history, not very strong sense of the present, so I must admit, and almost no sense of the future. I would say humanities, it's doing well by objective metrics like student recruitment or publications or how many people watch documentaries on various subjects. But it doesn't seem to have a sense of confidence or the future. And that's really what I'm trying my best to unlock a little bit of here. I look forward to your contributions there. I just Googled yesterday humanities crisis or some phrase like that, and it came up with a slew of articles from the most famous periodicals in the world from the last year only, pretty much. The most interesting one I thought that's thought-provoking and encapsulates this moment, and the author might be with us online from the US, David Westbrook's recent book, Social Thought from the Ruins, Quixote's Dinner Party. This is comparing the state of humanities now to the famous Spanish story Don Quixote. Yeah, you'll be familiar with it. It's 400 years old, I believe, and tells the story of an old man who still wants to be a heroic knight, goes out, gets confused with a windmill as a castle and something else as a dragon and so on, and is essentially trying to be heroic in a world that just doesn't match his sense of reality. Like reality and his reality don't match each other. And also Westbrook in this, it is quite a polemical text. I'm sure he'd be happy for me to say that, but notices that a lot of the concepts being deployed and especially attacked against in humanities are sometimes 30, 40, 50 years old. And indeed, he argues the world has moved on. So humanities is not mapping on to the nature of reality anymore. And this is something I really want to get at through the nature of this talk. But I found that extremely thought-provoking, if not a bit melancholy. But hopefully he appreciates, and others do, that we're doing our best to work out where to go next. So Why Chomsky? So, as Mark mentioned, I do run various projects outside of the job, as it were, in history. It keeps my passion for the subject alive, but also that of public and policy engagement with humanities and history in particular. And I've been working with this particular brand name, Project Hindsight, named after a US Department of Defense project I'm going to talk about later. And I've done various case studies. I presented some a few years ago in this seminar. And in the summer, a publisher got in touch with me out of the blue and said, Michael, I'm really impressed with this work you're doing. Would you like to write a book about this? Because I think applied humanities has got a really strong market to it. And it had not occurred to me, but I thought, what a great idea. Yeah. So, when time allows, I will almost certainly produce that and look forward to doing so. It will be 1, maybe 2 years, something like that. But look forward to it. So instead of presenting what I thought I was going to do at the seminar, which would be a series sort of extra updates on XYZ, I thought, why don't I try to present the introductory chapter of a book that summarizes my 10 years work in this space? Yeah. And for that, you really need to, that was an interesting challenge over the summer for me to think about how would I frame what I'm doing? The notion of applied humanities versus sort of non or something else. And it got me thinking that, what would I anchor this in? I thought, okay, maybe we can make it into a generational thing, generational shift. We often compare the baby boomers to millennials and so on, as I'm sure I count as. So I thought, what's the most famous thing I could think of from the 1960s to anchor my emerging study against? Yeah, and argue, well, things have changed, so we need to be more about application and impact and relevance and engagement and all these phrases that we use. So I'd heard somewhere in the grapevine, of course, I knew aspects of Noam Chomsky's career, as I'll talk through fully in a moment. But I'd heard of some essay he wrote in the 1960s that's launched his career out of sort of academia into the public domain. I'd never read it, but I thought that must be the origin of the term I associate with somebody like Chomsky, which would be to speak truth to power. And I thought, well, that's easy. I say Chomsky said in 1967, you speak truth to power. I say you don't just speak it, you have to do it, you have to influence, you have to engage, and you have to kind of design your projects rather than just speaking at stuff. So I found it very easily on the internet, no problem. Come back to that. And I discovered, oh no, speak truth to power is not mentioned in this essay at all. And moreover, then I went to a regular internet search, thought it'll be somewhere else. And I discovered it is not actually in Chomsky's oeuvre at all. And I don't know where I made the connection, but it was false. And history, as I always say to my students, is a great way of generating reflexivity, testing one's assumptions. And actually, I discovered, I was not familiar with Chomsky's oeuvre by this point, but now I am. He said, actually, in an interview in 2010 and others, was asked, when you have criticized this formula, speak truth to power, used by Edward Said, who I'll talk about later. And he responded, first of all, you don't have to speak truth to power because they know it already. And once I read that sentence, it punctured my entire assumptions about what I was going to do with this chapter/broader project. And I got intrigued. I read further, many videos, many books, and so on. For those of you familiar with this kind of research, you get a tiger by the tail and you want to keep sort of pulling it up like a thread. All right, so I became interested. And the obvious point is to read the essay itself, and we'll unpack that later. But just to get a little bit into Chomsky's career, because I realize now from speaking with people, even just at the introduction stage, people have different areas of interest in Chomsky's enormous career going back to the 1950s. And I thought I'd just quickly package it into 4 sections, because 2 of them will be my particular focus. The first one is this one, which will be very famous to colleagues here who are linguists, who are many people intimidatingly so in the audience, looking at phrases like, I do not fully understand, but syntactic structures. Hands up, who knows what that means? 1.5. Okay. It's a very old book, so fair enough. But Chomsky studied at MIT in the 1950s. He's a young scholar. There's him in 1967. It must be said it's a really cool picture. And became a full professor of linguistics pretty quickly. So that on its own constitutes a very successful academic career, I think you'll agree. The most accessible aspect of this career is this documentary movie called Project Nim. Anyone watch this? Yeah, much more people. So this is actually, it's a very interesting, at first kind of funny, but then ultimately quite sad story about trying to test Chomsky's linguistic theories in real life, essentially, and by raising a chimpanzee as a human. And they wanted to be blunt about where they got the idea from, so they called the chimp Chomsky. And he lived quite a long time, but it's not a very successful scientific story, shall we say, and one would not now get ethical clearance. But it is a super interesting documentary and gives you an insight into linguistics as a very dynamic, energetic field, as I'm sure it still is, but in the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s. The area which we will be focusing on more fully is as a political activist and public intellectual. In February 1967, as we'll unpack quite closely, he published an essay in the New York Review of Books, which then gained huge popularity, and 1 or 2 years later was produced as a much thicker book called American Power and the New Mandarins, a really savage critique of the United States foreign policy in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and of the structure of the US state, and of the role of experts, and of the role of intellectuals, and many other fascinating topics. And from 1967, you have to remember, was arrested, denounced as a communist, anti-American, all these phrases, McCarthyite-type phrases we'll be familiar with. Probably stung that bit more because he's Jewish, but also you have to remember the Pentagon Papers had not yet been released, the secret documents smuggled out about the Vietnam War. Only after this do we discover that he was right, that the US government was in some ways lying to its own citizens about the progress of the war and numbers of casualties and so on. Yeah, so then you can see in 1971, noting the Pentagon Papers in the United States had actually kind of confirmed some of his opinions that he'd been calling out the US government. A very confrontational and oppositional stance, I would observe. Then went on in the 1980s, really, to produce another work which would be regarded as a magnum opus of most people's careers, Manufacturing Consent, an analysis of mass media, which of course mostly meant newspapers, television. I think this is regarded generally a bit old school now in the communications world because we don't read so many newspapers or watch television, but it is very interesting nonetheless. And then the fourth phase, which I'd say is where he still is, 96 now, is as a global political economy critic of globalization, so-called neoliberalism and other concepts, financialization and that kind of thing. And we will actually come back to this. Notice the word neoliberalism from 1999. The same year of the battle in Seattle, if anyone remembers that, the World Trade Organization, which I sure remember. And then you can see there are many videos and interviews and studies from Chomsky with the word neoliberal appearing from then on. Yeah. And I will argue that he is, in fact, one of the main people who's amplified this term. And you'll see why I'm mentioning that later. 2003, described by the New Yorker as one of the greatest minds of the 20th century and one of the most reviled. Some choice moments in the career that are worth revisiting, in addition to the ones I mentioned. Who has seen the interview with Michel Foucault, 1971? Okay, only two. Now, you should all be seeing this because it's just amazingly weird and crazy and clever, and it covers they cover history, science, language, consciousness, creativity, law, the state, violence, and probably several other subjects in quite a short space of time between what I would regard anyway as one of France's leading 20th century intellectuals, Michel Foucault, a history and philosopher of science, and Chomsky, who's a linguist and by this point known as also a political kind of thinker and activist, a kind of leader, I would say. It is really worth watching, and it sounds like maybe an odd thing to say, but the acoustics of this, whoever recorded that in that hall in the Eindhoven University of Technology was brilliant at it. It's like a case study in how to capture the mood. It's like the movie, the Conversation came out a couple of years after this, 73, 74. And it's the whole thing about capturing the atmosphere with acoustics. It's just brilliant, the acoustics. I sometimes have it on in the background, almost as background music, without the speech so much, just to hear them reverberating. Beautiful. This one here is a bit of a curveball, but Jacques de la Rocha, who you may or may not know. Anyone, hands in there, who do you know who this is? 1, 2, 3. Shame on you. So this is a singer from a band called Rage Against the Machine in the 1990s, absolutely totemic of the anti-globalization period. And you see de la Rocha here interviewing Noam Chomsky, quote, "His books have helped me understand the nature of globalization and its effects on people and societies throughout the world." And for those of you who know this guy's music, for someone who's so confrontational and defiant in a cultural kind of performing sense, to see the deference in this video is extraordinary. I mean, he brings his notepad with his questions on the, excuse me, Professor, could we discuss it, like a young student. It's really extraordinary to watch if you've seen him live. I'll put it that way. And I'll just, to give you a sense of scale, I mean, this Zach de la Roche alone has billions of hits on Spotify, YouTube, sales, whatever, radio, all these kinds of media. So we're going for a big sort of secondary impact, if that's what I can get at. And I would love to, by the way, if anyone's doing a kind of communications dissertation or something, to do some retrospective impact analysis. I would love to build up a structure of how to do this. And the other one, so this is Naomi Klein, another choice moment in Chomsky's career, named 95 by this point. There's Naomi Klein with her visiting lecture at Imperial College, which I found really encouraging. It's really interesting. Thanks so much to her for doing that. In her recent book, Doppelganger, notice something very weird has gone on, because Chomsky in particular, but herself, have been attacking so-called neoliberalism, international finance, globalization, these concepts, usually thought of as something that left-wing people attack. And now the attack also comes from Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's former kind of chief advisor, Donald Trump and many in the current US Trump administration. And as she points out, this is a very confusing ideological mix, apparently bizarre, I wrote there, and it is. And I would wonder if it's any more bizarre than some of the shifts that happened in the 1960s we're going to talk about. I don't think this is unprecedented, but it just is, it is discombobulating for sure. So let's move on. This one is really funny. I'm glad that you laughed, because it means that some of you know who this is. Just, while we've done all this deep thinking, do watch the 2-minute interview with Ali G, right? This is a British comedian. He dresses up as a kind of youth spokesman and speaks to really famous people, like really top drawer politicians, and in this case, Noam Chomsky, right, in his office. And it is absolutely hilarious compared to all these serious matters we've just been discussing. And just look at the expression on his face. Right, what have I got tricked into? Chomsky starts with, you're a professor of linguistics, how many words do you know? And then starts to proceed with all the words he knows, starting with parachute. And it's so funny. Anyway, so let's get on to the meat of today's seminar. So this is a very famous essay. I'd say people cite it as much as Lion and the Unicorn by George Orwell, where Orwell differentiated between patriotism and nationalism. This is very different to what Chomsky does. But it is very interesting. There are a number of people I've spoken with who know Chomsky's work but haven't read this. So I look forward to unpacking it. The 60s, to me, in context, when I was 15, 16, this was the 1960s, right? Hendrix at Woodstock. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper photo shoot was just after Chomsky's essay came out, like a week later, something like that. And then you've got generally hippies, free love, flower power, all these kind of wonderful things. And it, to me, initially anyway, a very romanticized period, including to myself. We, of course, know it was the period of the Vietnam War. And we'll unpack some contemporary perceptions of the Vietnam War a bit more. But as I'll outline, I've been doing some research work on aspects of Cold War defense research and development. So Mr. McNamara there is of great relevance to me right now. It also, on the ground, was not all flower power and hippies and Woodstock. It was a very violent decade. All three of the major political figures on the right were murdered, of course, JFK, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and there are many others. And this picture on the left, which is just freely available on the internet, is at MIT, in fact. I can read the text. So helmeted police with mics plow into militant anti-war demonstrators in front of the instrumentation lab at MIT. Some of the demonstrators are attacking two policemen. The police dispersed the cursing demonstrators. Right, so in a university, you had open conflict between the security forces and anti-war students. We think of anti-war protests in the 60s as being pacifist. Some of it was, some of it was very not pacifist. It was very militant and designed as such. I wonder what would happen if people tried to do that now. But anyway, what's interesting is they're doing this at MIT, because if you can see the slides, the contemporary debate was, what was the role of the MIT in the so-called military-industrial complex feeding into the Vietnam War? Yeah. So the term, some people say there's a lot, using this term, the sixth wall of the Pentagon, to describe MIT as a singularly involved university in that conflict, as did these protesters believe. And some people, interestingly, including Chomsky himself, who was there, usually denies a large amount of war research. And someone, just showing how famous Chomsky is, someone wrote a whole book just on Chomsky's time at MIT and its involvement with war research and his alleged influence on linguistics as a consequence, which he then wrote an entire rebuttal of, saying it's not true. But just that, it's so interesting to see these different aspects of that decade and how some are remembered and some aren't so much. So let's look at this essay. The most famous quote from this that almost everyone knows is to speak truth and expose lies. I checked and it is in there, unlike this quote I used earlier. It generally is really interesting for Chomsky's developing thoughts on geopolitics and the media, all developed much more fully in later texts. And as Phil Tinline's Ghost of Iron Mountain has explored, it does have it's a really interesting attack on what you might call experts and intellectuals, and he does differentiate them, as I will, such as what these are Walter Rostow, Henry Kissinger, and Herman Kahn, all famous Cold War figures, have been co-opted by power, apparent rationality, tough-mindedness, and pseudoscience. Cult of the expert had become fraudulent. They were involved, as Chomsky's got it, in essentially a cruel war by the United States against an unfair war, but against an unarmed or badly armed adversary. But I'll unpack that better. So let's actually say, what does the whole essay say? Phil, did you read the whole essay? Yeah? Yeah, good. Okay, well, you're probably the only one who has, and me. So we can have a bit of a rapporteur situation. So he opens the first line, 20 years ago, Dwight MacDonald published a series of articles in Politics. Dwight MacDonald was a kind of leftist political thinker in the 1940s. And specifically the responsibility of intellectuals. Anyone who knows me, I like to check my sources. So I checked, is this true? Yes, Dwight MacDonald did publish a book, and particularly a very short and less good essay on responsibility of intellectuals. MacDonald was concerned with the question of war guilt. To what extent were the Japanese, German people responsible for atrocities conducted by their governments? MacDonald engages with the claim from Germans in the post-war period that some people were somehow aloof or exonerated from German atrocities during World War II, and he tries to sort of where does the line fit? And we'll come back to a quote on that. The issues that are as pertinent 20 years ago as they are today, we can't hardly avoid asking ourselves to what extent the American people bear responsibility for the savage American assault on a largely helpless rural population in Vietnam. So this is something we're only deeply reading the social history of the 1960s. You really get a grip of is young conscript men in the 60s whose fathers and uncles and so on had fought in the World War II, who felt that they were heroes, they had fought a good war against a cruel adversary and won. And the sons are being conscripted in very large numbers to fight a war which is very different. And some of the more, I'm not saying it's right, but some very thoughtful people essentially said, well, we're the Germans now in this new war. We're the aggressors, the cruel imperialists, right? And Chomsky essentially is, throughout this essay, is essentially making this comparison. He does so much more explicitly towards the end. So it's very interesting, but he's saying, the responsibilities of intellectuals, of peoples, change over time, which is a point I'm going to come back to. It's a long time ago now. The other area that I'm particularly in history of social science, Daniel Bell, a very famous sociologist in the 20th century, who came up with the term post-industrial society, I think 1977. So he engages with Daniel Bell's wonderful book, End of Ideology, The Exhaustion of Political Ideas in the 50s. What a name for a book. Bell argues they've lost interest, these intellectuals, in converting ideas into social levers for radical transformation of society. These radicals have instead found comfortable positions as post-war affluent welfare state technicians, tinkering within a welfare state framework, and must replace the commitment of total ideologies of the past, which were concerned with the transformation of society. And then also, this is the kind of, the border, brokering point, with a bridge point, which I think is super interesting, and I want to come back to this in the conversation at the end, if possible. It is true this consensus is most noticeable among scholar experts who are replacing free-floating intellectuals of the past. Right, so an overlay, a more technical, professionalized, instrumental type of thinker compared to what he called free-floating intellectuals. Very interesting. And then the closing is the last section of it. There's a lot on the Vietnam War in there, but the closing passage is meant to be this kind of general lesson. If it is responsible for the intellectual to insist on the truth, it is also his duty to see events in their historical perspective. Thank you, Chomsky. It's a point I'm making as well. And to use historical analogies. And this is where he compares the Vietnam War to the Third Reich directly, and I think a lot of people found that offensive, I must admit. Chomsky's closing remarks. Let me return to Dwight MacDonald. Again, he really has to make it blindingly obvious what he's talking about, and the responsibility of intellectuals. MacDonald's quote an interview with a death camp paymaster who burst into tears when told the Russians would hang him. Why should they? What have I done? He asked. Yeah, and that's a question which still hangs over us today, historically and in relation to other wars. This kind of borderline of what counts as collaboration and what counts as just doing a job, right? We know this as one of the principal kind of World War II questions. The question, what have I done, is one we might seek to ask ourselves. This is the last line, as we read each day of fresh atrocities in Vietnam and blah, blah, blah. But the question, what have I done, is one we might ask ourselves. And this is actually, responsibility is in my title today. And I want to raise this, what have I done, or what will I do next? It's going to be one of the crucial things I ask you to take a little bit of responsibility for. But the world has changed, and we need to analyze that. So this was a long time ago. It's not the Vietnam War anymore. What I find interesting is how people still cite this 1967 essay as though it's current events. I'll actually be arguing the context has changed enormously, and so might how we engage with events as well. What is the relevance of this essay today? Who should pay attention? It says responsibility of intellectuals, right? Is that you? Is it none of us? Is it all of that? Like, okay, we need to drill into that a bit better. And what needs updating for the 2020s in a fashion that Chomsky had done directly in relation to the 1940s? As far as I know, Phil might be able to help me on this. No, has anybody done this?
Well, updating, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Phil is the author of the Iron Mountain book I just mentioned. So thank you to colleagues for contribution of this. What is an intellectual question? It's not something I've explored personally before. And there were many I could put in, but it's just a little bit here. Famously, Antonio Gramsci, the Italian thinker, who's definitely an intellectual in my mind. His idea was there are two kinds. You've got some that emerge from existing structures, such as teachers, scientists, literary figures, and administrators. And then you have as the world changes and moves on. I was talking about this with a colleague earlier. You get a new kind of intellectuals pop out of these new sectors that emerge. Yeah, and I would love to know what your thought on who the intellectuals of digital media are, especially social media. Is there an intellectual class within social media? I don't know. If so, then Gramsci may be right. Then there's Edward Said, already mentioned and famous for coining the term Orientalism, still cited by students to this day. He said, okay, so in contrast to the early 20th century, when there was a real pretentiousness, if I may put it like that, amongst self-defined intellectuals, explicitly not engaging with mass consumption or mass culture. There's a whole book about this. He said, well, you have to, rather than attacking your wide audience, you need to gain a wide audience who is a natural constituency. I agree. Now, this is the thing I want to come back to. It says the oppositional figure, a spirit of opposition rather than accommodation that grips me, because the romance, the interest, the challenge of the life is to be found in dissent against the status quo. And I'm actually going to be disagreeing with this here. I don't think we're in a world where we need more dissent. I think we could do with more accommodation and more construction, and that's exactly one of the points I'm going to get onto. But as you can see, there's our list of famous intellectuals, and there he is. Now, of course, you have to have a response from Chomsky himself, because you just can't, whatever happens in the world, you can just type it in, like Chomsky and Apollo program, Chomsky and Brexit, Chomsky and whatever, you can find it, yeah? So Chomsky and intellect, how did he get it? Because in the essay, he doesn't actually explain what he means, right? So then he unpacks it in later interviews. And this one was particularly useful. This is fine, this bit. You'll like the next bit, I think. People with relative privilege, training, resources, opportunity, ability, and in a position where you can get involved in some fashion in affairs matter to human beings. Which I would say probably all of us in this room and probably everyone listening counts in that particular category. It's a very maximalist approach, a term I'll come back to. Now, with apologies to friends and colleagues who are scientists, I'm going to show you the rest of the quote. It excludes a great scientist who just stays in the laboratory and wins the Nobel Prize. It excludes someone who's working so hard putting food on the table he doesn't have time to think about these things. So let's talk why, if at all, it should exclude a great scientist with a Nobel Prize in a laboratory. It's a very explicit and thought-provoking exclusion from this very broad definition. So this is more of a traditional slide. So this, I could pack it with data and graphs and evidence if you really want, but I thought I'd just summarize. So 2020s, since 1999, Chomsky's amplification of the term neoliberalism has mushroomed, I argue, becoming an entire view of reality rather than a dominant political economy. I've got some extra slides at the end I did not actually include. I was going to unpack that a little more. But I just think that this term is now more of an obstruction than a useful one. The way Chomsky unpacks this, IMF, World Bank, all these things, at specific organizations, companies, business, media, all this, that's great. Yeah, I can engage with that. When it becomes an ism, detached from any institutions or any people or with names on, I find it very difficult to grapple with. And I read a whole other study, which I've just put on the internet quietly, about Taylorism, are making this point for 50 pages or something. And I hope you find that interesting. I'll link to it on the slides. You will, I'm sure, agree with me without even lots of charts that there's now a saturation of media by comparison to the 1960s. The idea of getting all the newspapers of the day and analysing them is inconceivable now. Or watching all the news of the day and comparing how the different political stances cover East Timor, for instance. And that is, some people find it very empowering, democratic. Some people find it kind of confusing, disorientating. The other one, now this, some people found, we did a seminar in here last year on this, on thought leaders. Some people found it completely unconvincing concept altogether, and that's no problem at all. But there's been more developments over the last year. There's whole books been written in the last 1 year about what is now a kind of subsector. And again, if I choose to make this the introduction to a book, I will actually seek to differentiate between a thought leader, influencer, intellectual, and then you've got your kind of scholar expert that Chomsky highlighted, because I think they are all different. And I think that's important for us to think about. Something else, again, a grandiose claim, but I can back it up if you want. Decline of large organizations across the political spectrum. So on the left, trade unions, on the right, churches, for instance, and other community organizations, has led to what some people call atomization, but I prefer Simone Weil's term molecularization of people. And any scientist in the room, please decide which is a better analogy, the molecule or the atom. But it's wonderful terminology. And then there's something, again, a grandiose claim, but I can back it up when I need to. Challenges to parliamentary politics. And there's a lot of discussion, which leader's popular, this party winning this vote, swing seats, all this kind of stuff. When you actually look at the chart, this is 3 months old, so it's not got the new Green Party leader in it, but all political party leaders in the UK have a negative rating. I don't know if you realise that. Like, I think people just don't look to parliamentary politics to address their issues of the day anymore. They're not waiting for someone to come to the rescue, a great leader or anything, like a Winston Churchill or a Clement Attlee. It's just a thing. People don't see Parliament as so relevant to their lives. I think it's a real shame. But democracy got a great boost in the 1950s, and now it's still a long time ago. This one here, you won't be able to see it. So the title is Americans Have More Faith in Google Than the Government. It's 5 years old, and it's American. It's so thought-provoking. The top 5 things that the Americans in the survey said they trusted a lot to do the right thing. Top 5 things. Your primary doctor, okay, family doctor, like the GP, that's nice, right? Okay. Following that, the military, then Amazon, Google, and then the police. And then Donald Trump, Warren Buffett, the news media, the US government, which is down to less than a fifth of my doctor, and Wall Street, which is 5%, so a tenth that I trust that compared to my family doctor. And if you imagine a polity, if you go, okay, parliamentarianism, right, in the 20th century, it may have seemed like a temporary blip. We think of it as permanent. But if you think of parliamentarianism as a, well, I don't want it to be a thing of the past, I must stress that. But just in case, what do people trust to sort of fill the vacuum of authority? And it's a combination of 2 big tech companies, the security and military apparatus, and my local doctor. Well, that's like a Black Mirror episode right there. And it is very interesting. But the nature of authority, I really think we underestimate changes in this. Yeah, and they're very different to the 1960s. As I say, we have 58 years has elapsed, right? And I would argue, and this is where we get very serious faces now, the nature of warfare has changed, right? Compared to the 60s and the 1940s, I sincerely hope. But it does, I don't know about you, I notice things like aircraft procurement, building machine guns, factories and stuff is in the media a lot more now, right? I'll explain why in a minute, why I'm particularly sensitive to this issue. But the nature of warfare, look, I can remember, I don't know who can remember the Falklands. It was very, very, very far away, right? Iraq, Afghanistan, I sure do remember those, right? Chomsky was involved in organizing students and so on for protests, right? But the last 10 years, warfare has changed. It's moved, as somebody put it in World War II, from the horizon to the map. Yeah. And I think this forces a change relative to that in the 1960s of people who think of themselves as either scholar experts or as free-floating intellectuals, whichever it may be, or both. So Chomsky asks, what have I done? And I'm going to display here the Necker cube. Who here has heard of the Necker cube? Nobody. Interesting. So this is a philosophical concept that I was taught here at Imperial when I did my MSc, Philosophy of Science class, right? By Hasok Chang, who's a brilliant teacher. He's now at Cambridge. And the Necker cube, you will know probably, is it enables or encourages the viewer to be able to switch their view 180 degrees, not a little bit, not to. It's not the same. A paradigm shift is different. Paradigm shift is a change from one state to the other. Necker cube, the facts are exactly the same, but your stance on them changes 180 degrees because you can see which is the back, which is the front, right? Is this the front and that's the back, or is it's a well-known image, but it's used in philosophy to try to get a really strong, generate a strong discussion about what does the kind of opposite perspective look like, right? And so this is one of these things. What have I done? I'm asking you to consider the world through a Necker cube now. What if in humanities, look, we have a lot of people producing stuff as though they're the scholar experts, whereas actually they want to be the free-floating intellectuals. My argument here is actually to embrace the free-floating thing rather than emulating what the scholar experts are necessarily doing, right? And this is, by the way, it's me speaking outside of my job capacity rather than in it principally. What if the bottleneck is no longer the production of research, of which we have enormous quantities, but actually distribution, engagement, impact? And that seems sort of obvious, right? But let's move on to some further points. I've been thinking about this a lot. And when you think about the world of humanities, social science, and arts through the Necker cube, and building on various conferences I've been at, where people at the very end say, right, what should we do next? And there's a little inklings of something. If I could sort of put them much more directly and upfront. So if you're good at deconstructing things, narratives and images and so on, you're also good at constructing them, presumably. And you might want to think of that also as a key task rather than afterthought. To dismantle, Audre Lorde wants to dismantle the master's house. Fine, free country. What do you replace it with? I mean, I would invite you to make this two parts of the same task, right? Find, dismantle, what are you going to build next? And critiques are wonderful, but also suggestions as to what else to do are also excellent. There is a tiny amount of literature trying to grapple with changing mindsets in this sense, because it's so hardwired into a Cold War way of thinking, of producing critiques as academic articles and things like that, that then might get dissemination further into documentaries and whatnot, but not so much institution building and engagement with big organizations like governments and the private sector. Yeah, and this is what this article gets at. I know some of you will recoil instantly at the concept of developing a return on investment of a history degree by Patrick Babaricki and Jim Cortada, who used to be at IBM. Patrick and I have a good dialogue. He's University of Texas. We're constantly challenging each other on these things, trying to move develop shape to what might the humanities look like next, which is exactly what a lot of people are calling for. And they say in their article to be open to the value of practical history. And I've highlighted the hardest challenge. This could be the hardest challenge. Yeah, because people, scholars, intellectuals, whatever the word might be, often see their purpose as essentially being outsiders critiquing things. And I'm saying we need to think of ourselves as accommodating and building constructively sometimes. Some examples. So there, I haven't thought of this on my own. In fact, there are several projects around the world. Patrick's Applied Humanities program at the University of Texas, for instance. But people are institutionalizing this notion of applying history, in this case, to real-world problems. also broadly humanities, social science, arts. But that's I'm building up a kind of database of all of them that I could find. But within history, they know me. We all know each other, right? It's a little tiny community. Time Machine is an EU project. That's my one. I'll come back to. Belfer Center at Harvard is the only university center in the world that has an explicit, like practical applied history unit. Library of Mistakes is in Edinburgh. The Long Run Institute is in Canada and Belfast, and Historians Without Borders is in Helsinki. And there are a couple of other university departments, usually in history and international relations, in the Netherlands and Cambridge that have got interests in this as well. So I'm just trying to I'll come back to what I'm trying to do. So let's get some examples because we've got 20 minutes and I'd love a conversation about all this afterwards. So what might sort of essentially joining in look like and working in interdisciplinary groups, trying to be productive, even in the specific areas that Chomsky was critical of, which is joining in with the US, essentially the Department of Defense, right? Okay. I'm sure the CIA is in there, but I don't know what they do. Anyway, but an interesting example, a relatively fun one, just to tell you about, is the SETI Institute, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, defining aliens. Yeah. Now, I don't know if you know this. It wasn't just launching satellites that played music. I'm sure you've all and had little gold discs and stuff on them. But they actually developed something called the Drake equation, 1961, which drew on astronomy, mathematics, and history, like specialist outputs from each of those disciplines. Why? Because you need astronomers to calculate things like rate of star formation, the fraction of stars and the planets per star. It's all good. Then you need mathematicians to do all the calculations, but you need the historians to work out the longevity of civilizations relative to planet life. What grand calculations these are. I don't know if they found aliens yet, but it's still a super interesting braiding of all these different specialisms. Again, in the period that and in the setting that Chomsky himself was critiquing. So I'm sort of deliberately setting myself inside like the man's office, right? If you know what I mean. Even more so, there's the actual man, Bob McNamara, right? We, myself and Leo McCann, I did my bit of the research like 10 years ago. It's finished, but Leo is writing a series of studies on Robert McNamara and the Vietnam War, his training in statistical control and how using statistics as a management tool affected the Vietnam War and McNamara's career also in Ford's and the World Bank. Right, interesting link to the neoliberalism point there at the World Bank. What we're doing specifically together is, again, exploring this thing actually called Project Hindsight in the 1960s, where the US Air Force had done a forecasting study on weapons development, and they wanted to use history to test the futurology, to develop a symmetry. So the USAF in the early 60s, late 60s was a historical one to compare. And they discovered what I thought they would, which is that people over-predict rates of innovation a lot when you compare it to the historical experience, right? This is a message I kind of want to get out there to certain technology messiahs. And this is a picture I found in the US National Archives. There's John F. Kennedy. You may as well get the famous ones in there, right? There's Bob McNamara. And this guy's called Howard Brown, who's the one under whose leadership of the USAF this was all started. He was a physicist and became the only Secretary of Defense of the United States who has a PhD in science. The only scientist. And now, of course, the job title has changed. But that's all an interesting study. We're eventually going to get around to writing it up when we have some time. But that's, again, another example from literally inside the institutions that Chomsky was critiquing. And so I'm saying there's actually something constructive to come out with this, something interesting, rather than being opposed to it, right? Outside of looking in type situation. Just some case studies, you can read them. I'm not going to read out the things you could read yourself. But I put them in order of kind of seriousness, going from least, what I would say is the littlest moral hazard to the highest. Yeah. So this is the kind of study you can download. I did it now 2017, just before I started my full-time role here. This was with a think tank called the Resolution Foundation. The leader of that is now the Minister for Pensions, and many of his colleagues that I work with are now advisors to the present government. And it was a study of we have too much information, we don't know what predictions for the future might be correct, which are over-exaggerated and so on. And I did a study essentially of the dot-com boom, 1994 to 2001. to compare it to what then was sort of big data, I think, was to use robots, these kind of words. Now we use more different terms like AI. And I hope you enjoy reading it if you want. But what I'm trying to say here is to people who think of themselves either as scholar experts or even the free-floating intellectual, as Chomsky put it, I think would have very little moral hazard in engaging with a project like this, right? There's no problem there to solve. You just got to do it. It's interesting, might have an impact. Then you move on. Okay, so then now we go to the private sector. And as Babaricki and Quartada point out, getting academics interested in the private sector is actually quite hard. I think there's a strong ideological overhang from an earlier period that we might need to reconcile ourselves with. So this is a study I did with a law firm a long time ago now, where essentially their digital skills base was all the skills base. They had no concept of how to work with paper at all, the young paralegals. And I just did historical research for a big law firm. And maybe some people might have found a bit of a kind of moral issue dealing with this. I know some will find none whatsoever. But if we refract it through the lens of the 1960s, maybe there could be some kind of issue. But the one, again, working with defense and military projects is works too far beyond the pale for a lot of academic humanists, right? There is a strong identity of having nothing to do with violence. I'm sure you agree, right? And it's not just a moral one, it's an identity organizational one as well, right? So I did these projects again before I was full-time here at Imperial for about 2 years. And I went through the kind of moral questioning that I'm really here to raise, like this Necker cube thing, to raise today to try to get everyone to think about a little bit as to where your boundaries lie, given our shape-shifting historical and political context. And I did that kind of thinking myself. It was a very long process, and it was worthwhile though. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about it more within the boundaries of the project, obviously. So the next steps we'll finish up and then have a wonderful conversation, I'm sure. What have I done and what can I do? This is literally what Chomsky finished his essay with. What have I done? Why don't we finish the talk with what have I done? And more importantly, as I was talking about with a colleague just here, what can I do next? I promised this in the advert. It's steps you can go away and use. So academics, scholars, intellectuals, whatever, sometimes have a way of working in what I would call minimalist way. Use this word maximalist, yeah? In the world of history, I genuinely never ceases to amaze me. Still, people will say I work in the short 18th century, but for the long 18th century, you need to go and speak to that guy at the other university. Like, it's history. Just, you have a specialism, of course, but think in a more maximalist way. And some of the people I've been describing here today already do that. Right? As I was just describing, if you're interested in this gray area, which has the expertise, the skill set, the passion, the energy, but is also interested in engaging in the broader world, do proactively form links with related people and organizations. And it's really lovely when people do it to me. And I hope it's encouraging when people do this when I approach them. It seems like a basic one. Most of us agree with this now, but just in case not, view the academic text as one stage rather than the end point. You can do more, you talks, kind of Chomsky was really good at this, I'll tell you that, and his career has been so stellar, probably because of his public profile in this respect, and anybody can do it now, as I said earlier. Many of the articles at the start of this talk were lamenting the past of humanities, and what I've tried to do, albeit in a what's the word I'm looking for, heavy-hearted way sometimes, if I may say, is try to celebrate what is happening and what might come next rather than lamenting what we don't do anymore, which is what many of the critiques of humanities and the articles and the campaigns or whatever are trying to recover the past rather than trying to generate the future. And then I think we're now in a time when it matters and we need to do this kind of thing. Even if it's just thinking, what would I do in 10 years' time if this? What would be my borderlines? Am I willing to be accommodating? And so on. These kind of areas that previous people have ruled out in prior decades, as I was talking about, going all the way back to the 60s, and for good reason then, maybe things have changed. So I'd just say bring your A game because we're in a time when it matters. And on that note, thank you very much. Thanks. Good.
Yeah, so if anyone's got any questions, perhaps we can start with the group and really raise your hand.
Do you have a question?
Bill,
Michael, shall I just-
yeah, we got a mic.
Okay. So just on the role of that text, responsibility for intellectuals, and Chomsky's ongoing presence in the culture,
Yeah.
not least manufacturing consent, which of course is co-written but nonetheless.
Mhm.
One thing that I've always been interested in with him is the degree to which he inadvertently or otherwise feeds conspiracy.
Yes. Yeah.
There's a text that goes with that I pair it anyway in my book by J.K. Galbraith called How to Get Out of Vietnam, and put extremely crudely and unfairly to Chomsky, the Galbraith thesis is cock up and the Chomsky theory is conspiracy. That is too crude, but what are your thoughts, given his sort of presentation of this, something quite concerted and behind a deceptive veil, about how his way of understanding power has informed conspiracy theory?
Yes, an excellent and extremely difficult question. And the role so Phil has written a wonderful book about conspiracy theories from the 1960s to date. It's excellent, by the way. All go and read it. And okay, so are you asking me about the 60s or generally?
More now, actually.
Yes.
Whichever you want.
As some of the other authors we talked about, Joe Bennett and I've forgotten the other book on conspiracy theories. David Aronovich wrote a book about any author on conspiracies point out. As soon as someone says it's a conspiracy theory, the conspiracy theory grows to include that person. So if I say, well, it's so and so is a conspiracy theory, it's an imperial college, right? It's a conspiracy. And I would love to be in a conspiracy theory, right, but I'm not. So my thoughts. So it's very difficult to analyze, and as I was talking about with this kind of left-right movement of critiquing globalization and neoliberal, like once it's out in the public domain and the status quo moves, you can be co-opted by it. Like in your thing, you said, was it kind of young, kind of liberal guys? Their text was co-opted by neo-Nazis, who. And the conspiracies are fascinating because the status quo that they're moving around changes so much. And that doesn't answer your question at all, but it is a super good point. Thank you. What is the nature of reality and what is not reality? Yeah. Have we got any online? No. Okay. Have I convinced everyone?
I think there's something online.
Oh, yeah. The products of what we do, academic, blah, 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 blah. Do we need to, who is this from? Oh, it's Leo. Yeah, okay, my co-author. Leo, yes. We're I mean, we're going sort of off topic, but also not. So statistically speaking, like in the humanities, I can't speak for the other subjects, but what is it? A fraction, 5% of people go on to careers as academics, yet we judge it as though it's going to be 100%. And yeah, I think things like assessments you mentioned there, training, curricula, I do think we need to refashion some of them to include more of this real world engagement type stuff, rather than a Cold War university which thought of itself as separate, perhaps, though I'm exaggerating. And indeed, it's great you say this, actually, LM, because some universities have reached out precisely to help, so I can help them with this kind of remolding degrees with a different kind of goal and skill set in mind. And it's great that they've done so. Thank you. Mark?
Great first.
Go ahead.
You're giving the impression that it seems to have got worse, this sort of professionalisation, narrow focus, militarised. Or do you think it's always been there? Do you think the sort of, like this point, professionalisation and the needs to strive, propagate, publish, and so you focus? And there was an Italian existentialist that argued that modern philosophy deals with puzzles, not questions. And you create a puzzle within a discipline, and everyone spends their time.
Yeah.
So it's completely sort of, but that's how you get on, because you publish a paper in this.
Yes.
You get into a tiny little debate with this person, and you get plenty of things published. You move up. Do you think that's worse now? Do you think it's always been? Do you think intellectuals are less engaged?
Firstly, something I was going to include is simply volume of people who might be included in it, like numbers of undergraduate degrees, PhD degrees, numbers of universities, nationally and globally. I mean, the number of people who would be in this kind of context we're talking about, who even have a chance to think about it, must have increased by 100-fold or something since the 1960s globally. I think you've probably got you've got a mixture, as always. You've got your Toynbee or whatever on the television, your teledon, as they used to say, whereas you've got your super scholastic kind of people just doing journal articles and conference speeches and nothing else. Where I think the issue is, you've got a lot more, because of the volume of PhDs the university sector has been putting out, you've got a lot more of the grey area, which mixes the two, the public realm and the university realm. Sometimes people with part-time jobs in universities also doing other things. And I think hopefully that's one of my principal audiences, is where people can find sort of opportunity impact, is by kind of embracing it rather than lamenting the fact they might not have a particular job or post at a given time. That doesn't answer your question, but it answers the one I wanted to answer.
There's thousands more of us, but we're all in much more complicated, much more constrained social machine. In that sense, I think the modern sort of siloing of disciplines and the modern sort of
but
is narrowing people's breadth of vision.
Yes, but I've never met anyone who silo things more, but we always complain they're too silo. I mean, I've encountered many admirable projects to break down silos, and I agree with them. But as you say, the structures we've inherited, which I might add, principally come from the 1960s, to do with promotion criteria, hiring, all the administrative type structures, they keep us magnetically fixed to what I would regard as things we need to sort of loosen up or make refashion, shall we say. Yeah, but I'll just say that you have to remember the volume of degrees the world issues now compared to the 1960s, absolutely enormous. Yeah, Mark, did you have a point?
Yeah, I just had a question about when you do your kind of consultancy work.
Yes.
Because you have your background in academia. Do you not find that when you go to work for, say, the Ministry of Defence or
that was 7 years ago, yeah,
or a big corporate company, that you have to adjust, and do you not find you lose a little bit of the academic freedom that you enjoyed?
Excellent question. I mean, the thing about me is I've had other jobs before universities where you get no freedom at all to do anything. It's nice enough, right? But the tasks are fixed, so it doesn't feel weird for me. No. And look, the book I mentioned right at the start there, the Westbrook one, it does say, instead of thinking of yourself as oppositional, it's speaking quite general terms, but why not think of yourselves as like humanizing the big institutions you used to oppose, is the kind of phrase. And I think that's a nice mindset. And I always, I wouldn't say set low expectations, but if you're looking for 100% change, it ain't going to happen. 20%, put that as your bar. If I improve something by 20%, maybe that's a win. And that might help settle the kind of quandary that you might have.
Sure.
Yeah.
Isn't there a question about energy?
Energy
In the humanities.
Yeah. Oh, what do you mean? Is there any?
I mean, there is.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Lethargy, loss of work, less funding.
Yes. Yeah.
Continue, and that's
A melancholy.
Yeah. And that's it's certainly in the UK that is really obvious.
Mm-hmm. Except with me, but yeah.
Well, I mean, we see more and more people moving out of the arts, the money, the cost of living, the whole thing.
Yes.
We're in that environment.
Yeah.
So, in the sense that, when you talk about leaders or leadership, we're at the bottom, we're at the decline, or going lower.
Are you asking me or telling me? This is the last question. I don't think so. I think if you want to view it as a decline, you'll find it. If you want to view it as a kind of fresh start, you could find that as well. And this is one of the things I've tried to get into this, is there are little shoots in there, if you know where to look for them, and to build them and to make opportunity and to adopt, to not too much internalize this notion of decline and it being individually my or your problem. Do you see what I mean? And to instead think, what can we do next?
So that is the general problem.
It is. It is, but correct. It's always this weird outsider perspective on their own situation. It is, and that's a good thing. because it means that people who are more purposeful and can think about it afresh can step in and hopefully add something to the situation. All these articles I showed earlier, that I don't kind of read them much anymore because they all say the same thing I already know. They tell me funding, like you said, but I'm already thinking like what to do next. How about this? Try this. Who can I talk to? What can I mean, something that I would just say might be interesting to a kind of academic audience is, I used to think I would have the biggest impact on the world by working on my own, typing texts. And now I hardly ever do anything on my own. And I really actively embrace kind of pairs or group projects for everything I do. I don't do any solo projects anymore, except old ones I'm typing up. And that is has been a really interesting thing to embrace because, as Greg said, it's not encouraged by the current kind of structures, behaviors, types of identities that people develop for themselves. Yeah. We've got to finish, but Daisy, yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that because yes, you can find green shoots and things like that, but if there is a cost of living crisis and people are not able to afford to do humanities, the people that are going to be left to do it are going to be a specific subset of the population who have the privilege to afford to do something that may not be paying.
Yes, and thank you, an excellent point. I would something I would love to calculate is the cost of doing humanities research, because I think it's come down a lot. I know mine has. In terms, I used to travel, 15 years ago for 6 weeks around the United States in a car, and now I could do that research in a day by just getting stuff online from the archives instead of driving manually to all of them. And hopefully that is, I would say, another green shoot. I think the cost of doing research, time, money, access to institutions, like having a library card used to be a really big thing. Like to a university library, that was making a break of your career. If you could write up the stuff, get in a library. I think you can access a lot of material now. And I think hopefully the kind of differential you're describing is decreasing, though of course I completely understand what you mean. Yeah. At the back, we're who's in charge here, Paul?
Me.
Okay. At the back.
The beautiful thing about technology is offering a way to kind of defocalize humanities and link with humanities in Africa, India, China, etc. Because currently we're trying to bring humanity perspective into environmental technology as we hear theory and trying to do it from an African perspective. With colleagues.
Yes, the horizontal horizontal networks you can build so much more easily than it used to be. You go to conferences, like I'm going to say in the 60s, you would go to conferences and they were very good for their time, but you don't sometimes need them to meet people anymore. I've contact with the US, Africa, India, whatever, horizontally for free, instantaneous, like build up ideas, collaborations, conversations. Conferences are fun, but again, the cost issue that Daisy was just mentioning, I think it is possible. I don't know, in 30 years' time, we can analyse retrospectively what all of this actually did. But for now, see it as an opportunity, I think, for sure. I'm glad to hear MSc Environmental Technology. I teach one class on this. Nice to see you. Yeah. Any more? Or no? Mark, are you going to finish us with a bookend?
No, just to say thank you very much, Michael.
Okay.